So to Agincourt, which arguably holds most similarity to the Battle of Watling Street of the Boudicca Rebellion, in that a smaller force managed to defeat one that was much larger. In this case, 6,000 Englishmen, not just small force, but exhausted as well from a long march across northern France in enemy territory, suffering from the effects of dysentery, which had spread through the army, still managed to beat an army of 20 to 30,000 men. A dysentery, by the way, is an infection of the intestines which causes severe diarrhoea. Now, I don't know if you've ever had severe diarrhoea before, but I'm willing to admit that I have, and I can say with total conviction that when struck down with a terrible affliction, I would have been absolutely useless at fighting. So 6,000 Englishmen, struggling not to poo their pants, faced 20 to 30,000 Frenchmen, many of whom were powerfully, fully armoured and mounted knights. Not worrying about dysentery. 5,000 to 6,000 of the Englishmen were archers, though, so 5,000 of the 6,000 Englishmen were archers, so that's a huge proportion of the English army, and that's one of the reasons for the success. But if Paddy Power was taking bets on this one, you probably would have got odds of over 100 to 1 on the English winning the battle. However, just as with the Battle of Watling Street before it, and other battles like Waterloo afterwards, the general, in this case King Henry V, organised his army to take maximum advantage of anything that he could possibly take advantage of. You might remember that the Roman general Suetonius put his troops in a deep sort of valley so his army couldn't be surrounded. And despite the greater numbers, the Celts could only fight so many Romans at one time because it was down a valley. Well, Henry put his army in a narrow gap between thick woodland, and the gap was about 750 metres across. He ordered his troops as well to hammer thick, pointed wooden posts into the ground at an angle so that any French cavalry charge would be blunted on them, because horses will not charge into big spiky things in the ground. And he hid some archers in the woods to fire on French lines, which was known as galling. Wasn't very chivalrous, which means it was kind of seen as cowardly and not a very knight-worthy thing to do. But galling is something that Henry did, one of his tactics that you'd mention in an exam, and he did it to great effect. So yeah, he could not, because he'd put his army in this area between thick woodland, he, just like Suetonius, could not be surrounded, even though he was facing a superior force. There were only so many people who could fit in the gap to fight at any one time, which nullifies the whole problem of being completely outnumbered, to some extent anyway. So the French were upset at this galling, so that the English archers hidden in the woods firing at the French, and decided to charge the English lines with the infantry following behind the cavalry, which the horses are a bit faster. The English waited until the French were about 200 metres away, which was certainly within range of the longbow, and close enough for them to fire him quite accurately, and they let loose with their archers, wounding horses, panicking some other horses, and killing some. So horses fell, and others fell from running into the horses that fell. Other horses panicked and ran into others, and the wooden spiked stakes slowed down any horses that actually made it through all of that carnage. It was a devastating volley of arrows, which, if you're thinking back to the training podcast, might be explained to some extent by the 1252 Assise of Arms, which made it a legal requirement for all Englishmen to own a bow. And, of course, the 1363 announcement from Edward III, again referring to the training podcast, that all Englishmen must practice bow on Sundays and on holidays. Of course, you might remember also that Englishmen practiced clout shooting onto a piece of cloth, all firing together at once, trying to land as many of their arrows onto a piece of cloth. The English also used a longbow, which required a great strength of arm, and took years of conditioning for men to be able to use. But these specialist, powerful weapons could pierce armour. And the result of all of this, in 1415, was the Battle of Agincourt. And I've started to explain how it had a big impact with the initial French charge. luck also played its part in this battle. Bad luck for the French and good luck for the English. And the luck in this case was the weather, because it was a very, very wet time of year, and the rain turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. So yeah, the French had really heavily armoured knights and big horses, but in really muddy conditions, that actually might make things a lot more difficult, trying to fight your way around with heavy armour on. So those knights, which had been knocked from the horses as well, then had to struggle through mud to get to the English lines, past fallen comrades and over dead or dying horses, all the time suffering from a rain of English longbow arrows, which were strong enough to pierce armour. As this was happening, of course, more and more Frenchmen were following up to trying to join in, but the effect was quite similar to that of Watling Street, in that there ended up being a crush on the French side, because the people at the front, they were getting killed or were struggling through, and there was a bit of a hold up from all the dead and dying horses and all the dead and dying men, but there were still more and more French trying to get through this gap between the thick woods. And this actually made weight of numbers a disadvantage rather than advantage because of the crush. A French monk wrote, "The first wave of about 5,000 men was so tightly packed that the third rank could not use their swords." That's third rank, could not use their swords. With the rain of arrows from Englishmen, who had had a lifetime of practice with the longbow, a particularly devastating weapon, the mud, the indiscipline of the French rushing to battle because of the galling, and the clever position of the English to nullify the French superior numbers, as well as, of course, Henry's decision to not be chivalrous and to use the galling tactic, the French were losing the battle. And, knowing this, Henry opted to ask his men to put aside their bows and to charge. The French, stumbling around over mud and bodies, retreated, and Henry sent a herald. So that's the sort of person that you send to go and they're sort of supposed to be immune from being harmed, and you send them to your enemy to talk to their enemy. He sent a herald to ask the French if they surrendered. The French did. Against all the odds, the English had won. They earned a lot of money from ransoming back noble Frenchmen that they captured to their families, and they managed to secure northern France for England. Northern France was controlled by the English crown. We'll finish, as always, by looking at some of the past questions you could be asked about Agincourt. For the one with the bullet points, see if you can think of something we've mentioned here that the bullet points miss and that you would be able to include in your answer. For any of the ones about why Henry was able to win, or his generalship in particular, well, you talk about galling, his decision to place the troops in between the woods, his decision taken at the right time to send his army in to charge, the fact that he got his archers to place the wooden stakes in the ground. All of these things explain why Henry's generalship was able to win in the battle. There we go, that's Agincourt.